Throughout history, people have asked the question, is there more to our world than just what is perceived with our five senses? Do some persons possess a psychic ability? Do spirits exist as ghosts or in other forms? Is the paranormal fact or fantasy? Well, now, perhaps thanks to the Russians, we're much closer to answering these age-old questions. While most Western scientists scoff at the mention of psychic and paranormal phenomena, in Russia, the study of the paranormal has been taken very seriously, so seriously that it warranted the attention of what was once the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, the KGB. And now, after the demise of the Soviet Union, much of this super-secret information is coming to light, including some astounding revelations known only to the KGB. I'm Roger Moore. Join us as we explore the secret KGB paranormal files. The United States and the Soviet Union have been on opposite ideological sides since they battled over Berlin after World War II. This dispute between the two superpowers evolved into the Cold War. An imaginary line now divided the world into two distinct parts. The Soviets on one side, the United States and its allies on the other. There were no concrete battlefields in this new war. Rather, each country proved its strength through the build-up of their nuclear arsenals and advancements in technology. With the arms race in high gear, secret information became a valuable currency in which to trade, and espionage seemed to be the modus operandi. But the Soviets took their intelligence efforts a step further, to paranormal espionage. The microwave bombardment of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow was just one example of the KGB's employment of paranormal tools. But interest in this field dates much further back to an unlikely source. The man who banned the practice of the paranormal and persecuted those who practiced any form of psychic manipulation, Joseph Stalin. In uncovered KGB files, the first name to appear was that of Wolf Messing.
Wolf Messing was a fabulous character. He started out in Germany. He then became known as probably the most famous psychic in Europe in the 20s, the 30s. There are a couple famous tests, and one kind of delicious one was he was tested by Einstein and Freud.
In an historic meeting, Messing was invited to demonstrate his mental abilities.
And as the story goes, they were in Einstein's apartment, and he said, "Okay, Dr. Freud, send me a telepathic message of what you want me to do." And he thought for a minute, and then he went into the bathroom, opened the cupboard, took out some tweezers, went back into the living room and said to Einstein, "Oh, excuse me, Herr Professor," and plucked a hair out of his mustache. And Freud said that was exactly what he had asked him to do.
Messing became quite famous for his psychic abilities. He even went as far as to predict the outbreak of war between the Soviets and the Germans, despite Stalin's infamous non-aggression treaty with the Nazis. He also predicted the end of the war to the month and the death of Germany's Führer. In light of his reputation, people began to take these predictions more seriously, especially the occult-obsessed Adolf Hitler, who put a 200,000-mark bounty on Messing's head. At the close of the 1950s, American intelligence agencies realized the USSR had pulled far ahead in the fields of science and technology. Desperate to close the gap, the United States redoubled its efforts in national defense, space exploration, and parapsychology research. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik into orbit. It was launched on top of an intercontinental missile, one that could just as easily carry an atomic weapon into orbit. But the space race opened a whole new field of experimentation with psychic phenomena. Recently uncovered reports indicate the cosmonauts were trained as psychic senders, able to transmit coded signals back to Earth with their minds. After the Soviets announced that they'd put a man into space, NASA initiated the Mercury and Gemini programs. But it wasn't until the Apollo mission that NASA delved into telepathic communications. NASA's most ambitious experiment involved astronaut Edgar Mitchell. His mission was to send telepathic transmissions from the moon to psychic receivers on Earth. Mitchell's accuracy in his transmissions far exceeded mere chance. But space was not the only arena in which the two superpowers vied for dominance. When the KGB learned of a secret psychic test done aboard the American nuclear submarine Nautilus, they too were given cause for alarm. The Nautilus was the same submarine that had recently made an historic crossing under the polar ice cap, demonstrating a nuclear submarine's ability to move within striking range of the Soviet Union, virtually undetected. Only one complication remained. The radioed launch command would alert the Soviets of an imminent launch. New reports of psychic tests aboard the Nautilus threatened to make radio communications unnecessary. The Americans had found telepaths capable of receiving messages deep beneath the ocean surface. For the Soviets, it was a nightmare scenario. The American submarine could now attack with no advanced warning. After Soviet and American intelligence agencies learned the value of silent, long-range telepathy, work began on a sort of reversal of this process, a potent form of espionage known as remote viewing.
Remote viewing is the alleged ability to perceive places that are remote and out of the reach of senses. This is how the Soviets described it.
Housed deep in the Department of Bioinformation of the Popov Institute, Soviet scientists continued their cutting-edge research into psychic phenomena. The KGB began a search across the entire Soviet Union, scouring universities and military recruits for the best, brightest, and most powerful psychics known to man. The best of these psychics were channeled into a research group under the direction of the Soviet military, Special Department Number 8, a top-secret group dedicated to military applications of psychic power. During tests of their abilities, the Soviet High Command was astonished to learn that they could see into sensitive government facilities and anticipate troop movements from behind laboratory walls. Scientists theorized that the phenomenon was the result of extremely low frequency waves received in the brain, corresponding with the brain's own alpha wave frequency of 10 Hertz. Einstein's particle wave theory suggested that subtle traces of information could be transferred to the brain on minute particles within these waves. However, the Soviets learned that they were not the only ones researching this new kind of telepathy. It wasn't long before the KGB came across an obscure publication by a research group attached to Stanford University claiming to have achieved similar results. After seeing this, the KGB knew that the Americans had discovered remote viewing.
The KGB was very much interested in the American development in the area of remote viewing because the KGB wanted to overtake Americans.
The KGB's reports identified Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ as the leading researchers at the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI. CIA documents captured by the KGB indicate that although impressive, Puthoff and Targ's work was met with skepticism from within the American intelligence community. But an event in May 1978 changed all of that. The CIA learned that a top-secret Soviet Tupolev-22 surveillance craft had crashed on a reconnaissance mission over Zaire. Naturally, the CIA was anxious to recover the craft for study. They employed sophisticated satellites to scour the jungle, but the dense canopy made such tracking impossible. Desperate to beat the Soviets to the crash site, they called in SRI's remote viewers. Sitting in a darkened room in California, Puthoff's psychic went to work. He was given only a description of the aircraft and the fact that it was lost over Africa. Slipping into a trance, he began to receive images. A jungle canopy, a river, and finally a large submerged object. An aircraft with its tail section protruding above the water. Further viewing sessions revealed distinct turns in the river and topographic features that could be matched to detailed maps. Within days, field agents made their way to the crash site and located the craft. Surprised by the speed of the recovery, President Carter asked how the CIA had done it. He was astonished by the answer. The Soviet government was understandably alarmed by the loss of their top-secret aircraft and desperate to learn more about the remote viewing capability of their American counterparts.
SRI is Stanford Research Institute, and it was at the time about the second major think tank in the whole of the U.S. And at that institute, they began the research into the Stargate program. Operation Stargate was the Americans' response to the discovery that the Russians and the Chinese were all using psychics to do espionage. All they had to tell them was the coordinates of where the place was. They could then go in and look there, examine any files in the drawers and read the letters on the tables and get absolutely reconnaissance level information.
The United States government began funding secret projects like Operation Grill Flight and Stargate to penetrate and gather intelligence on Soviet military installations and weapons plants. One of their psychics, codenamed 518, was tasked by the National Security Council to remote view a Soviet facility in the Arctic port of Severodvinsk. Spy satellites had detected heavy construction around a particular building, but could not determine what was happening inside. 518 sank into his trance and began to search the building. He saw flashes of light from arc welders and a giant double hull under construction, a submarine. The viewer described a long, flat aft deck with missile tubes below, a tall rudder at the tail, and a new propulsion system. The craft was larger than any known submarine in the world. The NSC confirmed this report when several months later, the first Soviet Typhoon-class submarine was launched into the White Sea. When President Carter found himself mired in the Iran hostage crisis, he turned again to the remote viewers. Working around the clock, they were able to penetrate the American embassy in Iran and follow the prisoners' movements as well as their captors, even reporting the mental states of the hostages. A commando raid was organized, but the rescue craft suffered mechanical failures and the operation was aborted. But the remote viewers continued to monitor the hostages until their release. Later, President Reagan would use the same technique to keep track of General Muammar Gaddafi and his army during the war with Libya.
4 miles. Stop. Get lock him up. Lock him up.
The Soviet Union was very much worried about any kind of American spying, certainly involving remote viewing or any other paranormal phenomena.
A remote viewer was by far the most perfect spy ever conceived, and the Americans' dominance in the field began to worry the KGB. And the best of these remote viewers was Pat Price. Price is seen here with SRI founder Hal Puthoff and a CIA scientist. The detail and accuracy of his remote viewing sessions astonished everyone involved with these secret projects. Over the course of his career, Price spied on impenetrable Soviet bases and submarines running deep in the oceans. It seemed that there was no barrier his mind could not penetrate, including time. In 1973, Price even perceived the onset of the Israel-Yom Kippur War before it occurred. And perhaps of most concern to the Soviets, he could see into secret missile bases where he kept track of the Soviets' arms increase, pinpointed nuclear missile silos, and found code words. The Russians were forced to find countermeasures to the threat of such detailed reconnaissance. After stopping in a restaurant in Las Vegas, Pat Price complained to a friend that he suspected a man had slipped something into his coffee. That night, Price was found in cardiac arrest, and he was declared dead at the hospital. But that's not the end of this strange episode. An unidentified man with a briefcase full of Price's medical records arrived at the hospital and convinced doctors that no autopsy of Price was necessary, and then neatly disappeared, leaving behind the disturbing question: was Pat Price the victim of a KGB assassination?